The following marketing information and discussion is provided for informational purposes only. It is not intended to be used as professional guidance or consultancy. You should find an agency for that. Comexis is a digital marketing agency, so feel free to hire us. But otherwise, just enjoy the show.
Hello everyone, welcome to The Buyer's Journey by Comexis, a discussion-based podcast on the ever-changing marketing landscape. I'm Matthew McGroarty, the social media content producer here at Comexis.
And I'm Josh Lyons, the digital marketing coordinator here at Comexis.
Today is day 2 of podcast week here at The Buyer's Journey, and today we're talking about a really great piece from George Nagayan on Marketing Land. He looked at a study which was conducted by Adobe Analytics that showed some really interesting numbers on podcast listening growth continuing to rise and some mobile app usage increasing. So podcast mobile app usage has risen 60% since January 2018, and the sector's growth is expected to continue as 45% of listeners said they plan on tuning into more podcasts in the future, which is again according to a study by Adobe Analytics. So the study, which combines survey information from 1,008 U.S. respondents and Comscore data comprised of 193 million monthly unique visitors to U.S. mobile apps between January 2018 and May 2019, found that 41% of podcast discovery occurs through online sources such as blogs and articles, soon to be Google searches, as we talked about yesterday.
Ding, ding, ding.
Ding, 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 ding. This report also states that 25% of current podcast listeners began listening to podcasts for the first time within the past 6 months. Nearly 3/4, 72% of respondents, perceive podcast quality to be on the rise, with just 6% under the impression that quality is decreasing. I think that's a really interesting number, that 25% of current podcast listeners started within the past 6 months. That is incredible platform growth.
Well, it makes me feel that while radio is still here, we know that it's slowly falling off. Mm-hmm. So you still have the standard listeners that are always listening to the radio that are starting to realize they didn't want to shy away from it because they've been listening to it forever. They started to realize I can basically do the same thing on my phone through a podcast, finding similar topics and shows that just make it more accessible, because you can really only listen to the radio if you're in your car, mm-hmm. if you physically have like a portable radio with you.
And you're specifically talking about talk show radio.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So it for talk show radio, whatever the industry, whatever the topic is, people are starting to realize that now you can, especially in the last, 6 months, where you can now do everything that you want in terms of listening to the same type of content. But it doesn't have to be just like in your car. It could be literally wherever, whenever, if you download it on your phone or on your laptop or on your whatever. You know what I'm saying?
No, yeah, I completely agree with you. I mean, I think so there's a chart about. Give me 1 second, folks. That was not the chart I thought it was. This wasn't either. I'm gonna cut.
I like the genre preferences chart.
Yeah, we're gonna do a second. So. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, and I think, one of the things that's really interesting that we may talk about later in the week, I mentioned in the last episode at the beginning that a new Variety article just came out with Conan O'Brien talking about, the rise of podcasting things. I got some thoughts on that. I don't know if we'll get a chance to talk about it, but I think, as we're going to talk about when we talk about, the genre numbers in a minute, a lot of this, you're seeing it from blogs and articles. I think a lot of the growth is also that, just in comparison to talk radio. Talk radio is typically focused on whatever, either some sort of pop culture, whatever. I think of, for example, Q102 has Elvis Duran in the Morning. 94.5 PST has their morning show, and it's very focused on poppy things that their demographics like, and their demographic is typically teenagers, typically teenage girls, and that typically ranges anywhere from 13 to 25 or so, or older. Obviously, you're not a teenager when you're 20 to 25, but you know what I'm saying.
Young adults.
Yeah, so it hits those demographics, and then I think of NJ1015 in New Jersey, where it's mostly talking about news, other current events, and things like that. But podcasts, because they can form these niche audiences, and because to some extent they can be more focused on topics, and they don't have to occur every day necessarily, or they can just be more evergreen, can talk about anything, right? Like history podcasts, true crime, comedy, et cetera, et cetera. And that's one of the things we're actually going to talk about right now. So in this study, 4 of the most popular genres are found to be comedy, educational history, and true crime / documentary, with video game and discussion panel podcasts among the least popular categories. There's a nice little chart that I'll include in the blog post. Comedy and humor took up 46% of the preferred genre categories. Second, at 28%, was educational, history at 27%, true crime / documentaries at 26%. Then it went down political, sports, science, advice, religion, and spirituality, financial and economics, music, musical artist discussion, film and television, technology trends, panel talk, video game. So I think there's a lot to be said for why these genres are the way they are. I think a lot of people like comedy and humor, and to be honest, if you're watching, not if you're watching, if you're listening to a radio show in your car, there's probably going to be humor elements to it unless you are listening to a more news-oriented show. So I think that makes a ton of sense. People like to be able to laugh and enjoy, a fun little chuckle on their commute to work or something, right? Gets a nice start to the day. But I do think it's very interesting just how much of a percentage higher comedy and humor is.
Yeah.
So, and then also 1/3 of millennials said they listen to 5 or more podcasts per week, accounting for the largest demographic of listeners. Slightly more than half, 52% of respondents said they tune into podcasts while working or commuting, and 42% said they listen in the car. I think that just adds more to why comedy and humor is so high. Sometimes you just need something light and easy that you can laugh at and not pay 100% attention to while you're doing something else, driving, working, et cetera, et cetera.
Now, do we know... hold on. Do we know that the 1/3 of millennials say they've listened to 5 or more podcasts per week? Does that mean the same podcast or multiple different podcasts?
I'm assuming it means...
or just in general, you've listened to 5 shows.
I think just 5 or more.
That would make sense, because I have one show that I listen to that it's Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So that's 3 already. Mm-hmm. Then I have a couple, I have my tiers. I have my top tier podcasts that I listen to all the time. If I have time for that, if I get through those and need more to listen to, I have the next show and the show under that. So I can cycle, make sure I listen to the one I always want to listen to. When I'm binging through podcasts and I need more, I have those others. So I wonder if it's, because I feel 5 or more different type of podcasts per week is a little overkill. But I do think that 5 shows per week mm-hmm. makes sense, and that is going to slowly grow, mm-hmm. given that a lot of podcasts, whether you listen to the big shows or even the smaller creators, they tend to be anywhere in the 30 minutes to an hour.
Yeah, typically 30 minutes or longer.
So when you start getting into shows that do, let's meet it at the middle at 45 minutes a show, I wouldn't be surprised if people are starting to listen to 10 podcasts a week as in the next 12 to 18 months, where as it's currently, you can see, it's mobile app usage mm-hmm. up 60%. People continue to start listening more to podcasts that they enjoy, but then also search for new ones that they like, and mm-hmm. to transfer over from the traditional radio and TV shows, those topics into mm-hmm. podcasts.
Yeah, I think also podcasts are able to take advantage of times when you can't really or shouldn't have a visual aspect to a thing. So what I'm thinking is, when you're driving in your car, for example, I went on vacation to Canada recently. I listened to podcasts. I had a lot of driving to do, because I had a lot of driving to do once I got into Canada as well, other than just driving there from New Jersey. And driving to Canada from New Jersey, I must have listened to 3 or 4 podcasts of varying length. Driving back, I listened to probably 3 of them, and then while we were driving in Canada, I listened to a pretty decent amount of them too. So, it takes advantage of times like that where maybe it is easier to just listen to something. And then we also have, commutes in general. When I used to commute to Manhattan, I was listening to a lot of podcasts for a lot of reasons. The first is they're smaller to stream and they're smaller to download compared to, booting up Amazon Prime and downloading a whole episode of like Hannibal or something.
Right.
Which is very good, and I did watch it when I was commuting in Manhattan. It was very good. Small aside, there's a scene where somebody gets their neck snapped, and I had it here, and clearly the person behind me was watching it as well. Oh. And it happened, and she went, and I felt very bad for her. She shouldn't have been screen looking, right. But I do feel bad that she maybe I was watching it and then I moved and then all of a sudden
you were trying to get more comfortable, so you did the whole lay back, phone up high, and then everyone behind you could see it.
Listen, I don't know if that was my fault or not. But anyway, my point is, at work, for example, most people can't have something visually in the background, but having something auditorially is nice and stuff like that. And I think it takes really good advantage of the fact that there are just times where you can't watch something, but listening to something, and maybe you're not feeling like listening to music or something like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, to follow up on that, especially, at least for me personally, I'm a big sports guy, as everyone should know if they've been listening. Big sports guy, big comedy guy, but I do have a lot of interest in, a lot of educational stuff and crime stuff that, I just don't spend as much time to listen to because it's just, towards the bottom of my list of things that I prefer. So it's nice when I get the occasional, all right, I'll change things up a bit. I want to listen to some educational piece from NPR, because NPR, I listen to a couple of their educational shows about startups and entrepreneurship and stuff like that. That's nice. To just get a little different feel from music or sports or humor. It gets a little more serious, stuff that I wouldn't normally watch if I was sitting at home watching YouTube videos or watching TV shows. So it gives a little shift in topic that allows me to watch something and listen to something when I'm driving in the car for an hour to go somewhere. So I think it's actually cool that it allows me to sort of dig into topics that I normally wouldn't prioritize, but now I have the ability to sort of slowly progress through it and choose when I want to listen to it.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about ad effectiveness now, which we're also going to be talking about later this week. There was an eMarketer report that I wanted to discuss. So this Adobe study found that the majority, 60% of listeners surveyed said that they looked up a service or product after hearing it advertised on a podcast, and 25% reported that they ended up making a purchase. On the flip side, 58% of respondents said they skipped podcast ads. And then in addition, the report also found that of the 72% of listeners who had heard a podcast ad, 33% said podcast ads were more engaging than ads on other formats, and 40% found that the ads were less intrusive than other type of ads. There's a lot to break down there, but what I think is really important is to keep in mind, and this is something that we might talk about later, depending on if we decide to cover that Variety article, which is, we mentioned earlier, podcasts in a lot of ways can fill very niche areas of entertainment in regards to topics. So you have true crime podcasts, you have, for example, I listen to a medical history podcast sometimes. You have comedy, right? And then you have all these other small little communities that get fostered. And the thing about fostering these niche communities is everything feels more, I don't want to say one-on-one, but you feel closer to the people that you are listening to because you probably learn about their lives or whatever, et cetera, et cetera. And that can make you more willing to listen to and find an ad effective and go and make a purchase. I know I purchased a couple things based on podcast advertising from podcasts that I've listened to, and I don't regret those purchases because they end up being things that, some of them were just lifestyle things, and they were a benefit to my life legitimately, so I'm glad I heard about them, right? You're always going to have people that skip podcast ads. That's an issue with them just being typically burned into the episode, easy to skip through. But at the end of the day, there's always going to be people that do that on YouTube, anywhere else that you're advertising as well. Mm-hmm. So just something to keep in mind. But also, 33% said podcast ads are more engaging than ads on other formats. Josh, you can also chime in on this because you listen to some humor podcasts.
Right.
I listen to some comedy podcasts. Every comedy podcast I listen to, those ads rarely are just dry reads.
Oh, well, that was
normally a bit.
That was the exact point I was going to make when you were discussing that last thing.
Good.
Is the usage of a live read, where it's not like pre-recorded. They skip to it and they'll be like, okay, like we're gonna get to this interview after this message, and then boom, it's, even though it's still them doing the read, it's pre-recorded. A lot of the podcasts I listen to, it's very like, they're talking about a topic, they're getting ready to transition to one. They'll be like, okay, like now let's talk real quick about X brand. And like a lot of the podcasts I listen to, it's like a lot of companies are doing this more, which I like, is it just says on it like, here's the product, go off. And they would promote, they'd be like, oh, so the X brand just told us to just start talking about this product. So you know what? We're just gonna start talking about this product. And they go on like this whole like bender of just 2 minutes of like telling you what this brand is, why you like it, that if it's clothes that they're wearing it right now, this is why it's comfortable.
Yeah.
It gives the freedom of, you get to still promote the product or service that the brand wants you to, but they get to put their comedic
flavor,
spin and their flavor, which allows you to want to listen to them and not just skip through it. Because there are podcasts and even ad reads that they do, that specific podcast, that it is very dry.
Yeah.
I want to talk to you about this. This is what it offers. This is the price. Here's the code that you can use to get 20% off.
Yeah.
And those, while I'll still listen to them sometimes, I sometimes feel the need to skip it because it doesn't have that flavor. So I like the whole aspect of a live read where they can give it their own flavor, and it sort of, one, it helps the brand because it's different, and then two, it helps the creators because they get to add their spin and have them listen to them more and like them more.
And there's two things I want to add. Listening to an ad for longer, because they're adding a spin to it, is better for the podcaster.
Oh, for sure.
Because it means more people are willing to advertise. So that's one important thing. And another reason why letting them ad little could be good, because it's not just good for your brand, it's good for their podcast.
Exactly.
The second is that if you're paying for a 60-second live read and they do a bit or something, you might end up with 3 minutes of content. And obviously that's not necessarily like 3 whole minutes of just going, your brand, your brand, your brand. But sometimes it's worth letting them 15 seconds a veer off, come back, because it's all related, right? Because you do end up with 3 minutes of advertising content that people are probably going to be more engaged with.
Especially for where I listen, because I'll just use it as an example. So Cash App, which is a big like banking platform that people use to buy and sell things and send money to people.
Venmo.
It's like Venmo.
Yeah.
So the one podcast that I listen to is very big on Cash App. It's the presenting sponsor. That every single time in the beginning of the show, it's presented by Cash App. They do a live read about Cash App. But then when they're talking about stuff in the episode, and it just comes up into mind, like say someone's mentioning like sending you money, or like, like they're big gamblers, so they mention about like gambling on money, they'll be like, oh, like I have to like Cash App this guy. And they always use Cash App. But if they ever mess up and maybe someone goes, oh, maybe I'll Venmo them, they'll be like, no, you got to use Cash App. Like they're sort of, the creators have in their mind, like this is our sponsor, and they'll start using them more in their bits when it's not their physical like ad time. So I like that too.
Especially when the shows are like just for most people who are listening to this will know, because it's likely you have some amount of knowledge of marketing, right? But like for those of you who don't know, for things like shows and radio, you are paying to be the headline sponsor of, hey, whatever, presented by whatever. So there's a chance in their deal, in quotes, maybe they had a thing like, please mention using Cash App as often as possible. But it's also possible that they didn't, but they want to be nice to their sponsor because their sponsor gives them money.
Exactly.
So of course they're going to say, oh yeah, use Cash App.
No, I just think it's funny.
But it is funny. It is funny.
It's funny because they so they're a big podcast. They have a lot of sponsors. It bounces around because like their business might like drop one person, add another one. So they have a lot of different advertisers and sponsors that bounce around. So it's funny when they say one and they just don't realize it because it's just out of them talking. They're having conversation. It might just be the first thing that pops in their head. And then one of them like makes a funny comment that's like, hey, you can't say that. You got to use them. And it's a cool way for the creator, like you said, to make content out of it because it's funny, and then also for the brand to get more recognition and use, it's more than what they paid for almost.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is great for everyone.
Yeah, and Cash App, if you're listening to this, we are accepting sponsors. Please give us money. Well, that's all for today's episode of The Buyer's Journey. Check us out tomorrow. We're going to be talking about some cool things that Spotify is doing for analytics on their platform for podcasters. So please check that out. The third episode of our podcast week. This has been, I've really enjoyed all these stories this week in regards to podcasts, and look forward to later this week when we're going to be talking about the eMarketer article, and then there's a chance we'll talk about the Variety article. I'm going to have to do a deeper dive into it, but I really do want to talk about it because it's a spicy one. But check us out on Comexis.com, YouTube, anywhere you get your podcast, and please follow us on Twitter at buyers_journey. Thanks for listening.